Welcome to Caspar, Wyoming, the second largest city in the least populous state. Hi, this is the Wyoming Traveler, and I'm overlooking the city of Caspar, Wyoming. In addition to the city, the mountain south of the city is also named Caspar. If you are curious, as I am, and asking who was Caspar and why is the city and the mountain named for this person, keep watching and I will answer this question and others. As you may have guessed, Caspar was a soldier. Caspar, Wyoming was named for Second Lieutenant Caspar Collins. But why did they use his first name and not his last? The story of Caspar Weaver Collins begins on September 30th, 1844 in Hillsboro, Ohio. Caspar was the oldest child of William O. Collins and his wife, Catherine Willis Weaver. William Collins was a prominent lawyer and member of the Ohio legislature. Caspar had a normal and from all accounts enjoyable childhood. From an early biographer, we know Caspar enjoyed drawing, hunting, and fishing. A boyhood friend stated Caspar knew the best fishing holes. These passions, drawing, fishing, hunting, are seen in his letters from Wyoming to friends and family back in Ohio. The American Civil War altered Caspar's life, as it did for millions of other Americans. William Collins resigned his seat in the legislature and lobbied political friends for authority to raise a volunteer regiment. Since Caspar was only 17, his parents were not in favor of his joining the army. They did, however, allow him to accompany his father as a civilian. In March 1862, the 1st Battalion of the 6th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, later the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, was ordered west to protect travelers and mail along the Emigrant Trail. The regiment reached Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming on May the 30th. It was ordered to guard the Emigrant Trail between present-day Nebraska Panhandle to South Pass, Wyoming. Since the overland stage had moved their route south to along the Wyoming-Colorado boundary, the regiment was also required to guard that trail. Colonel Collins established his headquarters at South Pass during the summer of 1862. Along the way, they passed Independence Rock, and Caspar left his inscription there along with hundreds of other people. It is from this location that Caspar wrote his first letter home. In it, he describes the landscape, the people he came into contact with, as well as hunting and fishing opportunities. He also described the infamous Wyoming winds. It was during this trip that he met the famed mountain man, Jim Bridger, who was acting as a guide for the regiment. While encamped at South Pass, Caspar went with his father and about 22 other troopers to explore the area between the Green River and the southern slopes of the Wind River Mountains. Once again, in letters home, he describes the landscape, the wildlife, his hunting and fishing opportunities. He seemed to be having a good time. Also, while in the area, he takes time to describe the travelers along the Emigrant Trail, as well as the various Indians they encountered. In one letter, he describes Indian war parties, the intertribal conflict, and the fact that they had been subject to several Indian raids. One raid resulted in the death of a teamster. He tells one amusing story about how he and another man built a lean-to with their rubber blankets. and slept outside in the rain rather than sleeping in the tent because several of the men were vermin infested. By September of 1862, he was back at Fort Laramie and remained there until the spring of 1863. During this time, he started to learn the Sioux language. Caspar's relationship with the Indians is subject to legend and myth. In an 1879 account of the Battle of the Platte Bridge Station, it states, "For more than 2 years, Caspar had been almost living with the Oglala Sioux." This statement is one of the many inaccuracies in the article. In 1927, Caspar's biographer, Agnes Wright Spring, states, "Young Collins became very friendly with the Indians and soon was able to talk with them in sign language." In a letter to his mother, Caspar writes about learning to speak the Sioux language. Another author, writing in 1942, biography of Crazy Horse, based on Lakota oral tradition, indicates that Crazy Horse and Caspar were friends. In his letters, Caspar does not mention the name of any Indian, let alone the fact that he was living with them. Most likely, he began to pick up some words from the mountain men he associated with while at South Pass. Once back at Fort Laramie, between 1862 and 1863, he had ample opportunity to visit and associate with the Indians who lived near the fort, thus becoming more familiar with their language. While a friendship between Crazy Horse and Caspar Collins is intriguing, I find no evidence that such a relationship existed. Caspar accompanied his father back to Ohio in April 1863. Colonel Collins was recruiting men for a 2nd Battalion of the regiment. One of the new recruits was Caspar himself. July, at 18 years of age, he became a 2nd lieutenant, assigned to Company G. In August, parts of the new 2nd Battalion were sent to chase after Confederate General John Hunt Morgan after his raid into Ohio and Kentucky. Later, some of the battalion were sent to hunt for William Quantrill following his raid on Lawrence, Kansas. Whether new 2nd Lieutenant Collins was part of either of these detachments is unknown. There is no evidence either way. What is known is that by October he was back at Fort Laramie and was detached from his company to command a section of a 4-gun artillery battery. By the end of the year, he was back with his cavalry company. In May, he commanded the military escort for surveyors of the Union Pacific Railroad along the route of the Overland Trail. In autumn, he was placed in command of 4 isolated stations along the Sweetwater River. Sweetwater Station, 3 crossings, Rocky Ridge, and South Pass. These were 4 of the most isolated posts along the Immigrant Trail. Caspar did not enjoy the assignment. Not only were the posts lonely, but the weather was fierce during the winter. In one letter, Caspar writes to his mother, "Tourists need not go to Greenland to see snow. Let them come to South Pass." He was required to inspect each one of these stations once a month. The stations were from 25 to 40 miles apart. Not only did Caspar and the other men of the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry have to deal with isolation, poor weather, but also deteriorating relationships with the Indians. While relationship between the whites and the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and the Sioux were never good along the Immigrant Trail, after the Sand Creek Massacre in the fall of 1864, it turned to open warfare. During the time, Caspar took part in the battles at Mud Spring and Rush Creek. In the spring of 1865, many of the troops of the 11th OVC were transferred east to be mustered out of the Army, including Caspar's father, Colonel Collins. The new unit, the 11th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, was to fill up the slack. The arrival of the new troops did nothing to improve the situation. The raid on livestock and the telegraph line continued. The men of the 11th KVC and the 11th OVC did not get along. The Ohio troops did not believe the Kansas men engaged the Indians aggressively enough, and the Kansas troops resented the Ohio troops' attitude towards them. This animosity was demonstrated in the clash between the 11th OVC commander, Lieutenant Brentley, and the 11th KVC commander, Captain Greer, over who would command the Platte Bridge Station. The conflict was resolved by Major Anderson of the 11th KVC by reassigning the 11th OVC and its commander to the Sweetwater Station. At the time this command squabble was going on at the Platte Bridge Station, Lieutenant Collins had been sent from Sweetwater Station to Fort Laramie with a detachment to collect remounts. What happened next is the subject of fact, speculation, and legend. What is known is that Collins sent the detachment back to the Sweetwater Station with the remounts while he remained at Fort Laramie. Why did he remain at Fort Laramie? It is known that while at the fort he ordered a new uniform. Was he waiting for his uniform, or did he remain for some R&R? Remember, Fort Laramie was the closest thing to civilization for hundreds of miles. Or was it for both? Also at Fort Laramie was General Patrick Connor, who was preparing for his expedition into the Powder River country to punish the Sioux and Cheyenne. Check out my video on the Battle of the Tongue River. I will leave a link below. Upon seeing Collins at the fort, Connor demanded to know why he was not at his post. When Collins told the general he did not want to ride alone in territory infested with hostile Indians, Connor accused him of being a coward. Some say Collins was still smarting by the accusation when he arrived at the Platte Bridge Station. On July 20th, 1865, Lieutenant Collins departed Fort Laramie with the male escort to the Platte Bridge Station. When they arrived at the station on July 25th, they found it in an uproar. Thousands of Cheyenne, Sioux, and some Arapaho warriors were in the hills west of the Platte River. They had been attacking soldiers, raiding livestock, and cutting telegraph wires. In the early morning hours, around 2 o'clock, Lieutenant Brentley, with 10 11th OVC troopers, and Captain Lieb, with the 3rd U.S. Volunteer Infantry, with 14 men, arrived from Sweetwater. Brentley informed the station commander, Major Anderson, he had passed a supply train camped about 20 miles west of the station, and an escort needed to be sent to bring the train in at once. Anderson dismissed Brentley and went back to sleep. The next morning, Anderson organized a relief force of 25 troopers to escort the wagons. The 4 11th KVC officers placed themselves on sick leave to avoid having to command the detachment. Major Anderson therefore ordered Lieutenant Collins to command the detail. Lieutenant Brentley tried to persuade Collins not to take the assignment. Collins replied, "I am not a coward, I know what it means to go out, but I've never disobeyed an order. I am a soldier's son. Collins borrowed Brentley's 2 revolvers and placed them in the top of each boot. Since he did not have his own horse, he borrowed a high-strung gray horse from a soldier at the station. He then presented his cap to a friend to remember him by and moved the detail out. Lieutenant Collins and his detachment of 25 troopers rode across the bridge and up the bluff. As many as 1,000 Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Lakota warriors were concealed near the bridge in the hills. Cheyenne warriors stormed out of the hills and ravines. Collins saw the Indians attempting to flank him. He ordered his men to wheel about, facing the Cheyenne warriors, and ordered them to charge. When two parties of Indians rushed in upon his rear. Then several of his men had been wounded, and himself shot in the hip. He ordered a retreat. What happened in the melee with Collins' command and the Cheyenne is uncertain. One account states that Collins fought to keep back the Indians while his men raced to the bridge. He was then surrounded and shot down. Another account is Collins stopped to lift a wounded man from the ground, putting him on his own horse. The nervous horse wheeled about and then bolted, carrying Collins, now shot with an arrow in the forehead, into the Indians. The battle was short, less than 30 minutes. Lieutenant Collins and 4 men in his detail were killed. The rest made it safely to the bridge. Check the video, The Battle of the Platte Bridge Station. Lieutenant Collins's body was found the next day. The following account is from one of the soldiers who found the lieutenant's body. He was stripped. The back part of his head was knocked off, his brains taken out, heart and bowels also, feet and hands cut off and tied up with telegraph wire. Depending on which account, there are anywhere from 24 to 96 arrows in his body. Lieutenant Collins was buried at the Platte Bridge Station. In March 1866, his body was taken to Fort Laramie and reburied with full military honors. In the summer of that year, his remains were then escorted to Hillsboro, Ohio, for final burial. In September 28, 1865, the Platte Bridge Station was renamed Fort Caspar in his honor. His given name was used because there was already a Fort Collins, which was named for his father in Colorado. 2 years later, the fort was abandoned and its buildings sent down the Platte River to construct the new Fort Fetterman. In 1888, a town was founded near the site of the old fort and named Caspar.